Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 4, Part 2. Chapter 4, Part 1, we discussed epithelial tissue. Chapter 4, Part 2, we'll discuss connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous system tissue. Although our discussions of muscle tissue and nervous system tissue will be fairly brief, given that we'll be discussing them far more in depth when we get to those chapters that are discussing specifically those topics. Okay, so this week, make sure you have answered the study guide questions for Chapter 4. Make sure you've taken Quiz 4 by Friday over Chapter 4 material. Make sure that you are looking towards next week. You have your adaptive practice Chapter 5 due next week, and just maybe something to kind of, induce some, hopefully not too much anxiety, but to just kind of keep thinking about is that we have an exam number 1. This writing, man. Exam 1 is going to be that following Thursday. So when we discuss Chapter 4, Part 2, it'll be the Thursday following that. 50 multiple choice questions. You'll be zooming in for those questions, and we'll discuss the exam kind of as that gets closer, but just kind of keep Exam 1 in your mind as something that's coming down the pipeline. And so hopefully you'll feel comfortable about the material by then. Okay. So, I've been having some issues with PowerPoint today. So if you're recording, you're seeing that issue kind of happen. So I'm waiting for this application to respond. So like I said, we will be discussing more of Chapter 4 this week, and then Chapter 5 next week, and then our first exam will be that following Thursday, which will include Chapter 5. Okay, so study guide questions. There's a nice long list here for Thursday, describing the various types of connective tissue, so on and so forth. These are found on the Moodle website, and then we'll be discussing them on Thursday. Okay, so make sure we learn about various tissues and origins, discuss how tissues are held together, compare and contrast epithelial and connective tissue. Remember, one is vascular, the other is a little bit more avascular, and sometimes it just kind of depends even within that tissue what's going on. Even with connective, much of it is vascularized, but there are some avascular types of connective tissue, muscular and nervous as well. Learn about the structure and function of membranes, and understand tissue repair. So we're hoping to kind of accomplish all those things with this particular chapter. Okay, so like I said, we'll continue our discussion talking about connective tissue as opposed to the epithelial tissue that we talked about last time. If you remember, epithelial tissue lines different membranes. You've got the different shapes and arrangements of those tissues. And like I said, this chapter I think is one of the most diverse in terms of the different types of cells and functions that we're talking about, far more than any of the other chapters that we've seen thus far. Okay, so connective tissue has two basic elements. You've got your cells and extracellular matrix. So cells kind of speak for themselves. We've talked about cells a lot. We talked about cells in Chapter 3, all the different components of cells. Cells can have very specialized functions. And then the extracellular matrix is going to be the things around the cells that help give them the structure. And so the extracellular matrix can be really important for connective tissue because it helps give structure to the cells that are around it. The connective tissues do not have any free surfaces, and it's highly vascularized. So I just kind of mentioned that vascularization means essentially that there is blood going to those regions, that there's blood being pumped in, and you can see that in the following image when we look at some cross-section of connective tissue, and has nerve supply. So you're getting blood and you're getting nerve supply to connective tissue. And these are both important, again, for providing nutrients, but then also communicating with the central nervous systems. Like I said, there are exceptions to connective tissue, and the exceptions for vascularization and nerve supply, or innervation as it might be called, would be tendons and cartilage. You're not going to see the same level of vascularization or innervation in those areas. So just using some of the lingo, hopefully it doesn't throw you off too much, but things like vascularization and innervation are just terms that are commonly used when you're discussing tissues. So it's worth just kind of maybe getting used to them and hopefully thinking about what they mean. Hopefully when the screen sharing is paused and I'm having issues switching between slides, you're not seeing this, my screen's not going blank, you can still hear me talk, but so I'm just going to kind of continue to wait for the screen to advance because our screen sharing is paused. The wonders of technology still seem to astound me. As soon as you feel like you have something figured out, another little issue kind of pops up. Might have to do this not in the normal presentation method. Might actually have to do more of a slide advancement. Okay. So for this connective tissue, this is a great summary slide just showing all of the different types of connective tissue cells. Now, really quickly, things like monocytes, fibroblasts, these are actual cells. Mast cells, you'll notice that there are cells as well. Plasma cells are also another type of cell. Cells, we think of them. Neutrophils are another type of cell. Eosinophils are again another type of cell. And adipocytes are another type of cell. Now, these are all different types of cells that fall within the connective tissue cells department. But I mean, things like reticular fibers and collagen fibers, elastin fibers, are all still considered cells, but their structures are slightly different. They're made of collagen and glycoproteins. They're strong and flexible. We'll talk about each one of these in the upcoming slides when we're talking about the fiber structure of the tissue cells. What's important to notice is that the fibroblasts are large flat cells that move through connective tissue and secrete ground substance. Now, ground substance is almost like maybe equivalent to, but not exactly, the cytoplasm of your body, because this is the material between cells and fibers, and it's made up of water and organic molecules, very similar to what the cytoplasm of your cells would be. But they do have specific compositions, so hyaluronic acid, chondroitin, sulfate, and glucosamine. These are all important organic molecules that are going to help break down ground substance and make it nice and viscous and watery. You don't necessarily need, stiff tissue everywhere in your body. There are some places where you're going to want some water, so this helps kind of provide this binding medium between them. And I guess I talked about fibroblasts, things like macrophages, eosinophils, neutrophils, and mast cells. They're all going to be important for your immune system. And so these are essentially immune system cells. And so these are going to also play a role in finding and destroying foreign invaders of your body. So if you look and read kind of the description of these cells, this destroys bacteria, this kills bacteria, this destroys microbes, this, is going to attack parasites. So anything that's foreign to your body, these are the cells that your immune system is going to release out there. They're fighter cells that are going to go find those foreign bodies and attack them or tag them or consume them in some way in order for you to no longer be suffering from these foreign invaders. Adipocytes, as we all have, are going to be fat cells. They play an important role in energy storage, in cushioning. I know people think of fat as being a bad thing, but there's definitely a role of fat within your body and your metabolism. I mean, one area that you're going to find fat that you wouldn't think is maybe right around your eye. There's just a nice layer of fat around there that kind of provides a little bit of cushioning, so your eyeballs aren't just bouncing between your skull and where they're sitting. So again, there are adipocytes that are placed there. So like I said, the square boxes are all kind of the very traditional cells that we think of. Many of them are immune system cells, and then we have the fibers there that have been X'd off as well. So just kind of a big overview of the different types of cells that make up connective tissue. And I think, again, this kind of bodes to the different diversity that cells can have, right? We learned about kind of your run-of-the-mill cell in chapter 3, but you can see here that there are all different types of functions of cells, far they're far more diverse and can serve a lot more functions than I think than what we originally anticipated. So my fun little screen share pause keeps popping up between each slide. So just make sure, I would say, to go through this slide, make sure you feel very comfortable going over each one of those different types of cells, giving maybe like a one word, or not a one word, but like maybe like a one sentence description of what each one of those connective tissue cells do, just because I think that can be really helpful just to kind of keep everything clear. And if you want to categorize them as like more the traditional cells and the fibers, that's fine as well. I think categorizing can be a really helpful study technique because it helps you start to draw the differences and similarities between types of things, right? When you're learning a laundry list of 15 things, sometimes learning what's similar and what's different can actually help kind of delineate those things within your mind. So like I said, if you want to make put together this list and just kind of divvy out what's the same and what's different, that can be really, really helpful. So I think what we might do here is actually, I'm going to try to exit out of PowerPoint here for a second and see if that makes it any more easy to view. Okay, so the next slide we'll talk about the connective tissue extracellular matrix. So again, this is located between the connective tissue layers, and it's composed of fibers and ground substance. So if you remember that previous slide here, you can kind of see the ground substance is a lot, like I said, the cytoplasm. It's kind of that liquid that's hanging out between this, and then you have your different types of fibers. You can see some of those here, and they're all kind of shown by different colors. And so we'll talk about each one of those fibers that are holding that extracellular matrix kind of into place and help giving those specific tissues a good amount of structure. So in terms of the fibers, you have collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. So if we look at collagen fibers, they're strong. They provide a lot of strength and a lot of pull. Collagen fibers we'll find in places like bone, cartilage, tendons. Those are all places you would find collagen fibers. Elastic fibers are almost exactly what they sound like. They're very elastic in nature. They're made up of elastin and can have a ton of elasticity that they stretch into. Those are going to make up the things like skin, blood vessels, things that are going to need to provide a lot of stretch in your body. You don't want them to be really rigid structures. They need to be able to pulse, they need to be able to move and respond to their environment. And lastly, what you can see here is a reticular fiber. Those are also going to be a support network for things like the lymph and the spleen. They also comprise the basement membrane. So if we think about the lecture you just watched for part 1, you had your apical and your basal epithelial tissue cells, and then underneath there you had the basement membrane. So your reticular fibers would help make up that basement membrane. So you can see here a nice picture of a collagen fiber, an elastic fiber as well. So it's just kind of nice to see what those types of substances look like, just not in a cartoon drawing. You can see what they really look like in the cell. Okay, so other types of connective tissue classification. So if you're noticing a theme among science and even anatomy and physiology, is there's often characterizations of things. So this type of connective tissue is just specific for embryonics tissues or within embryos. So the mesenchyme is just going to be most of the cellular tissue that makes up the embryo. So here you can see kind of the reticular fibers and the ground substance and the nucleus of the mesenchymal cells, and how this makes up a majority of the embryonic tissue before it undergoes more specific differentiation into other types of cells. Here you can see a more developed fetus and the mucus cells. And so the specific cross-section that you see here is of the umbilical cord. So you can see the ground substance, again, that's part of the connective tissue, the nucleus of the fibroblast, which is another connective tissue cell that we just talked about, a collagen fiber, which is a type of connective tissue. And then here you can see that there's the epithelial surface of the umbilical cord as well there. So that's going to be part of that mucous connective tissue of the umbilical cord. So you can see here that there are other types of connective tissues as well: loose, dense, cartilage, bone, and blood. Loose would be areolar, adipose, and reticular tissues. Those are all examples of, mature as an adult, the types of tissues that you would see. So those are different types of loose. Dense would be things like dense regular, dense irregular, elastic. Those are all types of dense tissues. Cartilage is much of what you would think of when you think about cartilage. That makes up part of the differences, or has a very close interaction with our bone. And then we have bone and blood. Since we'll be talking about bones in a couple chapters down, specifically right before we talk about the skeleton, we won't talk about bone a ton now, because bone and blood have such a very tight relationship and function. We won't discuss those a ton today, so just maybe focus on these first few things like loose, dense, and cartilage, just because you've got enough to memorize. But just make sure you understand that bone and blood also fall under the classification of being mature connective tissue, and that's where they fall in the bigger picture of things. So if you are watching this and you would like to see a video on connective tissues, maybe open up the PowerPoint that's listed on Moodle, and you can click on this link and it will send you to the Wiley Plus website, and you can see kind of a quick video on connective tissues. So we're going to continue our discussion talking about membranes. So membranes, as they're defined here, are flat sheets of pliable tissue that cover or line a part of the body. So this is a lot of different areas. We obviously have a lot of different parts of the body that we need to cover. We talk about membranes. There are two different types. First, you can see that there is the epithelial membrane and the synovial membranes. We'll talk about examples of each one of these. Mucous membranes, serous membranes, and cutaneous membranes are all different types of epithelial membranes. They're made up of different types of epithelial tissues and serve each of their specific function because of their structure. So let's talk more about each one of those. So what's nice about these presentations in this textbook is it does a good job of kind of giving you an introduction and then showing you a picture of what it just talked about. So this is a great example of that, where we're looking at the mucous membrane. And you can see here in the mucous membrane, you've got these columnar epithelium cells, right? You have mucus that's being secreted onto this lining of the small intestine. You'll also recognize that there are goblet cells here that are releasing those secretions. Again, these are all things that we just talked about in chapter 4, part 1. These are going to line body cavities that are open to the outside of the world, so anything that kind of has that exposure. Mucous membranes are great because they allow for lubrication of the surface. They allow for enzymes to break down anything that gets kind of ingested, whether it's an enzyme that maybe breaks down. Let's say you have a bacterial cell, there might be an enzyme that's broken down by that, but it also allows a good way for your immune system cells to also get into those areas as well. Here you can see the serous membrane of the pleura, so you can see how there's slightly different structure of cell that we just talked about, right? The epithelial cells. So the mesothelium. So the serous fluid is going to be excreted by that. You see they're very flat cells, and so I'm not going to tell you what type of cell they are. I want you to go back to chapter 4, part 1, and see if you can characterize both the shape and arrangement of this particular cell, just because I think it's good practice for you to kind of join together those concepts. So it could be just for a second, instead of me just telling you the answer here, maybe going back and asking yourself, okay, what kind of shape is this cell? What is this arrangement? Hopefully you can come up with the right answer for those serous membrane cells. It shouldn't be too crazy because you hopefully just watched that lecture, and that shape hopefully isn't too tough. Okay, so next we have the skin is going to be the next. So here you can see, we'll talk about this a ton next week in chapter 5, where you've got the breakdown of the different levels of skin. You've got your dermis and your epidermis, and again, this is going to cover all of your body. The largest organ of your body, since it has such large coverage, it's very important as a protectant, but we'll talk again far more about the functions of skin next week. And lastly, what we have down here is synovial fluid, and you can see the synoviocytes are the types of cells that are going to secrete that, and this is just going to provide synovial fluid that kind of cushions between the joints. So synovial joint contains synovial fluid, and that just provides cushioning between those joints. And so it's important that those synoviocytes are nice and happy, so they can provide that nice liquid secretion for that cushioning. Okay, so next we'll talk very briefly about muscular tissue. So muscular tissue, we'll talk about this more when we get to the chapter. There's 3 different major types of muscular tissue. We'll talk a ton about skeletal muscle tissue. We'll learn all about the skeletal muscles. Cardiac tissue looks very different from skeletal tissue. So last time we talked about pathology and histology, and if you were a pathologist or a histologist, how you would use that to diagnose diseases. And so if you were a pathologist and you took histology of skeletal tissue versus cardiac tissue versus smooth muscle and looked at it under a microscope, they would all look very, very different, and you should be able to tell the difference between those. And also, if we had a lab associated with this course, you would be looking under the microscope and seeing those different types of tissue types. But skeletal obviously has a tight association with our bones, uses our bones for leverage to provide motion. Cardiac tissue is found in our hearts to allow the pumping and oxygenation of blood to all of our organs. And lastly, smooth muscle, we'll talk about smooth muscle, where that's located within some of our organs. Okay, so if you're interested in muscular tissue, this might be a great introductory video for you to watch. I know many of you are, pre-PT, pre-physical therapy, same thing, exercise science, so you're probably very excited for these chapters to come up. Okay, next we have nervous tissue. So nervous tissue, there are really just 2 general types of nervous tissue that we'll be talking about. Neurons, which are the signal sending types of tissue, and the neuroglia, which are what they call generally the support cells, or the neural glue that help the neurons kind of conduct their activity. Now, for many, many years, it was believed that neurons are the only tissue that kind of matter in the brain or do anything in the brain, but neuroglia actually have a ton of functions as well. So we'll talk about what those functions are when we get to that. Most often they play kind of like the cleanup of neurotransmitter that's being released, or they might have some immune functions. But when we look at, let's say, neurons have a cell body, which is much like the traditional cell that we think of. They have dendrites. I should be drawing and not hand gesturing. They have cell body, much like we would think of a traditional cell body. They have dendrites that extend off of them. Dendrites kind of look like branches on a tree. Those branches are basically reaching out, looking for chemical messages from other cells, and it's basically inputting all of that message to the cell body, and then that message gets sent down the axon, and the axon is right here. And we'll talk about this cell structure far more when we get to that chapter, so don't stress out about it now if that seems really in depth. But they can carry sensory or motor information and perform integrative functions, which I think is one of the main functions of the central nervous system. Their peripheral nervous system is going to be carrying more sensory and motor information. And like I said before, the neuroglia protect and support the neurons, but also, do their own thing a little bit and have a very important role in the brain. So if you would like to watch a video overviewing nervous system tissue, please feel free to open this up in your PowerPoint. Again, it should send you to Wiley Plus and should be super informative. So excitable cells, when we talk about nervous system cells, neurons, and muscle fibers. They're considered excitable cells because they exhibit electrical excitability, meaning that if you have a certain amount of ionic influx that causes them to become, positively, I guess, internally charged, and they react in some type of way, or there's some type of outcome. So electrical is the ability to respond to certain stimuli. So again, it's this nice idea of sending signals or responding to signals. Neurons send signals and as well as receive them, and muscles are going to receive signals and then cause some type of reaction. And so in the case of both of these, that message is going to travel along the plasma membrane, and it's going to be able to react because you have these special voltage gated channels. When we get to talking about the nervous system, or maybe even the muscular system, we'll talk about exactly what voltage gated channels mean. It basically means that you have channels that if enough positive ions influx, it's going to raise the internal voltage of the cell, and once the internal voltage gets to a certain point, those voltage gated channels will open. But we'll have, again, a much more lengthy discussion upon that when we get to that chapter. But when we talked about transporters and channels and things like that, this is an example of kind of how that information applies. Okay, so obviously we introduced in chapter 1 how important homeostasis is for the human body. So as with almost every one of these different mechanisms and different systems we'll be talking about, maintaining homeostasis is very important. So in the case of tissues, if you destroy or harm a tissue, homeostasis has to be maintained, and so you have to repair that type of tissue. So the different types of tissues are going to repair differently. So epithelial tissues are replaced by division of stem cells or undifferentiated cells. I think if you remember when we talked about chapter 4 part 1, the turnover of these cells is very rapid. They slough off, or in some cases we saw how some secretions actually just exploded the cells. But because they're so mitotically active, meaning that they divide a lot, they just get replaced and kind of come back into replace themselves within that tissue and maintain this tissue structure. Not all connective tissues have the ability to repair themselves, so you're not necessarily going to see the same level of mitotic activity. If you wear down a connective tissue, it doesn't necessarily get replaced as easily as an epithelial tissue. Muscle cells have performed limited repair. You can have repair of muscle tissue once it's been damaged, but the turnover for that isn't great necessarily. Some nervous cells can perform limited repair, others cannot. We'll talk about age as a factor for repair here in a second, and just recognize that if you are a young person, the younger you are, the better your body is at repairing itself. That's again kind of another bummer about age, is that you literally your body just is not as efficient at repairing itself. So if you're super young, you can actually compensate or overcome some of these, and nervous system tissue is a great example of that. If you damage nervous system tissue as a young person, you actually have a better chance at recovering from that. Nervous system tissue, for many years, people did not believe that there were any type of stem cells or any type of repair mechanism for those. There are 2 places in the brain that have stem cells, so there is some ability for that to occur in the brain. But then if you look at kind of the peripheral nervous system, there are instances where reinnervation of tissue can occur. It just kind of depends on the degree and where that damage has occurred. When damage does occur, usually there's a scar there, and that scar can sometimes also look like fibrosis, and that's a formation of scar tissue in those regions of damage. So aging in tissues, we just talked about kind of the advantages of being a young person. So again, a young person is just better. They have a better nutritional state. Their bodies are processing and breaking down foods a little bit better. You have better supply to tissues, meaning more vascularization, right? Coming back to that term again. And you have a faster metabolic rate. So again, you're just breaking things down more quickly. And aging slows the process of tissue repair. So just all the immune system cells that are responsible for going out and finding these sites of damage are, just not as maybe aware. And then you also have a lot less elasticity as well in tissues. So it, I guess, hits upon the last bullet point here. So the stretch that people have in their skin as a young person just isn't there as an old person. Just think of as a baby, or even you right now, like how your skin is just like wonderful. You can do anything to it. There's, you know, no damage or what have you. But the older you get, the harder it just gets for that elasticity in your skin to stay there. Many beauty products and millions of dollars have been put forth to kind of maintain that elasticity. Like I said, homeostasis is important to maintain. So epithelial tissues tend to be more specific for individual organs. So if you do have some type of disorder, so something like the stomach, the lining of the stomach, if you have a homeostatic imbalance in those epithelial tissues, it's specific to that region. So you just might see ulcers of that region. Disorders of the connective tissue tend to be autoimmune, meaning that your immune system is attacking itself. And so some of those immune system cells that we saw, there's a dysregulation in them, and they basically are not able to determine self from non-self, and so they attack self, which is autoimmune. Self-immune, meaning that you're attacking yourself in some way and destroying those tissues. And so lupus is a great example of an autoimmune disease. Disorders of the muscular nervous tissues will be discussed in later chapters because, you know, they're pretty wide and diverse as well. So we'll talk about that in a sec. So really quick, this week, please make sure that you have answered your study guide questions for chapter 4, for quiz 4, chapter 4, for homework 5, chapter 5 due next Monday. Keep your eye to the future. Next Thursday is going to be our exam 1. Really quick, I'll just kind of prompt you to make sure you, if you have any questions about this, feel free to go to look in the textbook. The textbook for this chapter is a little bit more in depth, and when we talk about these different types of tissues, if you're like, oh, I'd really like to see an example of what type of tissue has this type of cell or that type of cell, our textbook has a great resource because they put together these tables showing examples of all the different tissue types and the cell types that are corresponding to that tissue. So feel free to go and use your textbook as a resource. Since you did purchase Wiley Plus, you have the e-textbook available to you, so you can just go in and look at the e-textbook. If you're having a hard time pronouncing words, which we're kind of getting into that area now, like if you just don't know how something is pronounced, the e-textbook is a great resource for that as well, because you can click onto the word and for specific words, and they'll actually pronounce it for you, so you can kind of hear it pronounced out loud. If for some reason maybe I'm saying it too quickly, or it's a word that I don't mention specifically in lecture. Also, there are flashcards available to make on the textbook part of the site as well. So if you're having trouble with nomenclature or just all the vocabulary, that's also another great study resource as well. We're coming down to that first exam, so thinking about things like flashcards, putting together tables, going back and redoing your adaptive practices, all are great opportunities for you to study and practice and learn this information better. Just figure out what works best for you. I will say everybody learns differently. If you are a visual learner and YouTube videos or Wiley Plus videos are the thing that helps you learn the best, then lean into that and watch those and maybe take notes or draw things. And I find that drawing is helpful for me, but like I said, everyone is different. So please make sure that you're figuring out what works best for you and just kind of leaning into it this week. Okay, well, thank you all for your attention. I apologize for any of the pauses between some of the presentation if that was distracting. Again, this wouldn't be technology if it didn't give us a few hiccups and stress us out every now and again. So thank you all, and hope you have a great week.